Now, leaders have started arriving in India's capital, New Delhi, for the G20 Summit. The leaders of the world's major economies will kick off their discussions to coordinate policy on food security, debt problems, climate action and, of course, the war in Ukraine. Several leaders are already here. UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has landed in the Indian capital. He was accompanied with his wife, Akshata Murthy. Sunak is expected to urge more support for Ukraine in the summit. Apart from that, a discussion on the India-UK trade deal and immigration policies is also expected. Leaders from Japan, the African Union, Bangladesh have also arrived for the G20 summit. Earlier today, the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and Argentine President Alberto Fernandez arrived in New Delhi. Meanwhile, the United States Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said that she will focus to build support to increase lending resources for the International Monetary Fund.
This week also provides an opportunity to discuss debt relief. We continue to support efforts to provide predictable, orderly, and timely debt relief to countries, including under the Common Framework for Debt Treatment, where progress has been too slow.
The European Council President Charles Michel says that it is difficult to predict if the leaders can reach consensus on a joint declaration.
I'm just observing that last time when we had the last meeting of the G20, we succeeded and we had a common statement, we had a declaration, and I'm observing that for some countries it seems to be more difficult today to agree on a clear position, condemning and also sanctioning Russia for this decision to launch this war against Ukraine.
Meanwhile, India's G20 Sherpa Amitabh Kant said the leaders' declaration will have the voice of the global south and the developing countries, while adding that the summit has lived up to the expectations of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Earlier, Prime Minister Modi said that India's presidency should be inclusive, decisive, ambitious and action-oriented.
New Delhi leaders' declaration is almost ready. I would not like to dwell on it because this declaration will be recommended to the leaders and the leaders will then accept it. And only after it has been accepted by the leaders, we'll be able to talk about the actual achievements of this declaration.
Now, apart from this, India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi is scheduled to hold a string of at least 15 bilaterals through the weekend, out of which at least 3 of them are expected to take place today. Now, according to the tentative schedule of bilaterals being held in India, Prime Minister Modi will meet with US President Joe Biden, Bangladesh's Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, along with the Mauritius Prime Minister. Right, as I said earlier, WION is right in the middle of it, in the heart of the action in New Delhi, getting you the latest updates as the summit gets underway. Joining me now is WION's principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibal. Also joining me is Voice of America's correspondent, Jessica Stone. I welcome you both to the broadcast. Right, Siddhant, let's start with you. Now, this joint declaration has become a topic of discussion and debate, and there's a lot of concern. Will we get a joint declaration? But some strong messaging coming from Amitabh Kant, the G20 Sherpa. He's clearly saying that it will represent the voice of the global south. Tell us more.
Well, that's the big question. Will there be a joint statement or not, given the fact that there are many divergences on views, whether it is Ukraine, where we know there is a big divide between the G7 country led by US versus Russia and China, or the opposition when it comes to China over Indian initiatives, the usage of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which is world is one family, or whether it is other views as well. We know that usage of fossil fuel terminology is something that is drawing opposition. But largely when it comes to Indian presidency, it will be trying to form consensus and bridge the divide when it comes to various warring to use the phrase. But nonetheless, this joint statement will have one focus area by India, that is bringing the voice to the global south. Now, there are two aspects to it. First, remember that India hosted the Voice of the Global South Summit earlier this year, and that feeds into the summit. And secondly, of course, when it comes to India's presidency, this is the first time so many countries of the global south are present at the high table when it comes to the G20 summit. That showcases that how India is keen, that it's just not the Western issues or problems that should be discussed, but it is the problems of the global south that should also be at the high table leaders meet.
Right, Siddhant, stay with us. I'll come back to you for some more updates. Jessica Stone, the VOA correspondent, is also with us. She's also in New Delhi at the moment. Jessica, of course, everybody's waiting for the US President Joe Biden to come. We know there's a big bilateral expected between the US and India, between Prime Minister Modi and Joe Biden. What can we expect there?
Well, he's literally going to get off the plane, that is Joe Biden, and go right into that bilateral meeting with Prime Minister Modi in just a few hours' time from now. And we expect that they will pick up where they left off in terms of the discussions that were held in June during the state visit. That means more discussion moving the ball forward on the GE engine deal. For example, the U.S. Congress has pushed that forward just August 30th. That was passed. And so there will be more conversation on what other export controls perhaps need to be addressed on the U.S. side to move that forward. Also, the drone deal that was announced during as an MOU during the state visit. And then we also expect, according to analysts I've spoken to, that we're going to see that last WTO, World Trade Organization, complaint be lifted, be addressed, be worked out. You know, a number of ongoing trade disputes were worked out during the state visit, about 5 out of 6 of the ongoing WTO complaints, and we anticipate that the last one will be worked out during this bilateral visit. And then, of course, continued conversations on that all-important G20 communique and how the U.S. and India can work together on some of the issues going forward with respect to the Indian agenda with multilateral lending institutions and their reforms. Priyanka?
Right. Jessica, thanks for that. I want to take my next question to both of you. Siddhant, first with you. Let's talk about the Russia-Ukraine war. That is likely to be a big topic of discussion and debate once the G20 members get talking. We know that the Russian President Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, are not coming, but their names are likely to come up in all the discussions that get underway. Will the Russia-Ukraine war be a sore topic of discussion?
Well, absolutely. The West has clearly said that they are going to strongly raise the issue of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. And we saw how the day started. The first press conference in Delhi today, just a day before the G20 summit, is by the EU President Charles Michel, who slammed Russia from India. And that is a way of the West to send a message across. But largely when it comes to the joint statement, we know the biggest issue that is dividing or making sure that when it comes to the ongoing divide that remains is the Ukraine conflict. Now, we also know that many Western politicians, the leaders who are arriving, who have arrived, have already expressed their dissatisfaction that host India hasn't invited the Ukrainian President Zelensky to attend the summit. Now, this is important, or perhaps I can give you a context to this, is that last year we saw when the Indonesian hosted the summit in Bali, the Ukrainian president was invited. In fact, the Indonesian president himself visited Kyiv and Moscow, both to invite the leaders of Russia and Ukraine. And there was a virtual representation by the Ukrainian leader, while the Russian side was represented by Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov.
Right, Siddhant, thank you so much for joining us with all the latest updates. Jessica, coming to you, I want to take the same question. Will the Russia-Ukraine war hamper the progress that could be made once the leaders sit down to discuss other stuff?
Priyanka, I think you're addressing me. I'm having a few audio issues here, but yes, absolutely. Obviously, there's a deep divide within the G20, and for that matter, in this G20, in particular when it comes to the Russia-Ukraine war, we know that the Russians have already said that they're not going to agree to the same language that was used at the 11th hour in the Bali, Indonesia G20 communique, and they've already signaled that unless their perspective on what's going on in Kyiv is captured in the communique, communique. They will not be signing on to it. You know, there's a real reputational risk, of course, to New Delhi. Nobody in India wants to be the first country to host the G20 and not have a communique come forward. So this is a real challenge from Prime Minister Modi, one that I know American officials are very keen to see that there is a communique that can be achieved. They've been asked repeatedly in press conferences throughout the day whether or not they see a path forward. We haven't gotten any specifics on what that path looks like, but American officials very much hoping that a final communique can be put forward that encompasses some sort of position,
Right.
if not on the origins of the war, at least on the economic impact of the war and the food shortages around the world.
Right, Jessica Stone, thanks so much for the latest, and thanks for joining us from the very picturesque location, the Baha'i House of Worship in the Indian capital, New Delhi. WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.